I have written another article for Beijing Review. It is titled U.S. National Security Strategy 2025, The Pursuit of Primacy Repackaged, or Continuity of Agenda. I have done a deep dive on the National Security Strategy paper. It is 33 pages long. In the deep dive, I go over many long, detailed quotes to counteract the handful of throwaway quotes many people are clinging to draw conclusions claiming that the United States is withdrawing to the Western Hemisphere and abandoning its pursuit of global primacy. And it never even mentioned Russia or China at all as a threat to the US, when in reality, the whole paper is talking about confronting and containing both Russia and China. I made that abundantly clear in the deep dive, but it's well over an hour long. People might just not have the time to do that. So I'm going to read this much shorter article as an alternative to get a summary, an overview of the National Security Strategy 2025 paper. As always, I will read the article. I will add additional information when and if necessary. I will show you the links that I referenced while writing the article. The 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy reaffirms America's decade-spanning policy of pursuing global domination with an emphasis on burden sharing in recognition of both the multipolar world's growing capabilities and the growing limitations of the U.S. itself. So it is the continued pursuit of primacy over the globe, but recognizing that many of these other nations are becoming stronger and stronger. The U.S. has its limitations. It needs to resort to burden sharing, or the creation of a burden sharing network in which the U.S. stitches all of its proxies together into a global network that it can use against Russia, China, and everyone in between. Despite the obvious intentions the paper expresses, and it is very obvious if you just read the whole paper, many have mistakenly interpreted it as a signal of the US's abandonment of global primacy, seeking to end confrontation with Russia and even China. Some have gone as far as suggesting the US seeks to shift focus toward the Western Hemisphere, yet even the initial forward by US President Donald Trump and the first sentence of the paper's introduction dashes this wishful thinking. And in the deep dive, I go over the introduction by US President Donald Trump and how he brags about pumping $1 trillion into the US military, expanding NATO spending, and even launching a war against Iran while preparing for war against Venezuela. It doesn't sound like anything has changed as far as I can tell, even from the very first page of the document. Bragging of wars and threats of future wars. President Trump's forward includes boasting about U.S. strikes against Iran as well as the buildup toward war with Venezuela. He also boasted about the unprecedented $1 trillion recently poured into the U.S. war machine and the vast increase in NATO spending by member states. The U.S. imposed that increased NATO spending on the rest of NATO. Investments wholly unnecessary were the U.S. in any way shifting focus from continued containment of Russia, Iran, and China toward the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. was really shifting back to the Western Hemisphere and abandoning global confrontation with everyone else. What does it need $1 trillion pumped into its military for? Why does it need to raise NATO spending from 2% of the GDP of member states to 5% of the GDP of member states? It doesn't add up, and because clearly that's not what is happening. The paper discusses reviving the U.S. military-industrial base to provide, this is a quote, the most capable high-end systems necessary for a conflict with a sophisticated enemy. So a lot of commentators are saying the paper doesn't mention Russia and China as a threat to the U.S., but who do you think they mean by a sophisticated enemy? A sophisticated enemy that does not exist anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, clearly referring to Russia and or China. The paper admits the failure of globalism as a means of establishing permanent American domination of the entire world, yet admits the primary objective of the strategy is, and this is a direct quote, to ensure that America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, and most successful nation for decades to come. Or in other words, to ensure continued U.S. primacy over the globe. This continued primacy requires encroachment upon and the containment of rivals, including both Russia and China. And we know that because how else could the US, with 25% of the population of China, a smaller industrial base, less developed infrastructure, and millions fewer STEM graduates per year than China, remain the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, most successful country? How can they remain on top with all of these obvious disadvantages without hindering, sabotaging, or otherwise setting back rising powers like China. In other words, China, just by nature of its huge population, its massive investment in infrastructure, education, industry, is going to surpass the US. How can the US remain on top unless it does so by containing and crippling China? And that's all US policy papers talk about doing, spanning decades, and that is what this paper talks about doing. As a matter of fact, that's what I say next. The rest of the paper is simply a revision of long-standing plans to do exactly that. So what does the US want? In this national security strategy paper has a part that basically says what the US wants. The paper outlines what it calls core vital national interests, including a desire to dominate the Western Hemisphere under the guise of fighting narco-terrorists. However, the paper eventually admits it seeks to prevent Latin America from pursuing independent foreign policies, including cooperation with what it calls non-hemispheric competitors. And again, they mean China and Russia. So again, they never named Russia and China, but all they talked about was Russia and China, and also a little bit about Iran. Regarding China specifically, the paper reiterates the U.S. seeks to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open, preserving freedom of navigation in all crucial sea lanes, and maintaining secure and reliable supply chains and access to critical materials. Since the vast majority of traffic through these crucial sea lanes, and I like to show people this all the time, this is CSIS, it's funded by the U.S. government and the most powerful corporate financier interest in the US, and they're talking about whose shipping is going through the South China Sea. And even if you don't know how to read, the picture makes it very obvious. It's China. And all of these nations in the region with also very large circles, China is their largest trade partner. So it's trade going to and from China, going through these crucial sea lanes the US seeks to protect. So do you think that the US actually seeks to protect these sea lanes or seeks to threaten and eventually disrupt them? You know, it's very obvious why the US is really there versus why they say they're there. Since the vast majority of traffic through these crucial sea lanes is coming from or going to China, this translates to the continued U.S. military buildup across the Asia-Pacific region, specifically around the South China Sea and other sea lanes designated as vital checkpoints the U.S. seeks to strangle China economically with. And I've shown people this 2018 paper, A Maritime Blockade Against China. And even though it says tactically tempting but strategically flawed, it's because at the time there were all of these obstacles. The paper talks about overcoming those obstacles. And since the paper was published, those obstacles have been overcome. Here is a map of where the US seeks to impose choke points on Chinese maritime shipping. It's called a distant blockade because it's being done just outside the reach of most of China's missile systems. And you can see how important Japan, the Philippines, the Chinese island province of Taiwan actually are for the US in maintaining this containment of China and potential blockade of China. And that's all this new national security strategy paper talks about is all of this cooperation the US must do with nations like Japan. The mention of supply chains and access to critical materials refers to the necessity of decoupling America's dependency on China for both, allowing a U.S. blockade to cripple China without impacting America's own economic and industrial power. Even though the U.S. will suffer as it decouples from China, when it imposes the blockade on China, that painful decoupling will now become an asset because now China's economy will suffer and America will have decoupled from China. So what it does to China will not affect the American economy. At least that's their plan. In regards to Europe, which includes Russia, the paper claims the US seeks to support allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe, but of which the US itself upended through the overthrow of Ukraine in 2014, the arming of Ukraine under the first Trump administration, and the continued proxy war the US has waged against Russia in Ukraine ever since. So it's talking about bad relations between Europe and Russia. Who created those bad relations? The US did, deliberately. Before 2014 and the overthrow of Ukraine, which the US engineered, Europe was working closely with Russia. Russia was trading cheap hydrocarbons, making money doing so, importing European goods. Europe was getting cheap energy bolstering its industry. It began trading with China, and things looked very optimistic. And then the US overthrew Ukraine. And then the US forced Europe to cut off Russia from 2014 up till 2022, and then even greater from 22 onward. The US did all of that. And now in this paper, the US is acting as if this all somehow happened all on its own, and the US is just an objective, impartial mediator trying to solve this conflict, which is absurd. It is a lie at face value. While the paper states a desire to avoid America's forever wars fought across the Middle East, it seeks to do so by preventing an adversarial power from dominating the region. This means eliminating nations like Iran and organizations like Hezbollah, and to do so by replacing long-term, large-scale war with proxy war, punctuated by short, intense acts of U.S. military aggression. Hence, the strikes the Trump administration already launched on Iran earlier this year. And an attack on Iran President Trump boasts about in the opening forward of the National Security Strategy paper. How will the U.S. get what it wants? Let's talk about that. These are all the things it wants. How's it going to do it? Far from withdrawing from the pursuit of global primacy, the U.S. clearly seeks to continue imposing itself worldwide, from Latin America to Eurasia and everywhere in between. The means through which it seeks to continue this pursuit, as stated by the paper itself, include the use of economic, financial, and military power, as well as soft power. It says we will maintain the use of soft power. They're talking about the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, which was folded under the State Department. It was never dismantled and defunded. It simply was hidden under the rug in the State Department and continues operating to this day. The paper, however, recognizes U.S. limitations in doing so, requiring a strategy often referred to as division of labor or burden sharing. I've been talking about this for a long time now, and this paper expands on that and explains how this is all going to work. It explicitly explains, this is a direct quote from the National Security Strategy paper, the United States will organize a burden sharing network with our government as convener and supporter. So it will create and direct this network, and it will support this network. And this network of burden sharing will be all of these nations the U.S. controls and uses as proxies against its designated adversaries. This approach ensures that burdens are shared and that all such efforts benefit from broader legitimacy. So whatever the U.S. decides to do, it'll have this burden sharing network to lend legitimacy to it, like President Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela because America says so, and so does our burden sharing network, which they've already been doing this for a long time. This is just expanding on that idea. The model will be targeted partnerships that use economic tools to align incentives, so coercing these nations through threats of tariffs and sanctions to get them to do what the U.S. wants, share burdens with like-minded allies, and insist on reforms that anchor long-term stability. Elsewhere in the paper, they talk about the primacy of nations and how each nation gets to determine its own policies and who it interacts with and how it interacts with the world. And then it's talking about imposing on the members of its burden sharing network, imposing reforms that anchor long-term stability of this U.S. agenda and this U.S. network that it's using. This strategic clarity will allow the United States to counter hostile and subversive influences efficiently while avoiding the overextension and diffuse focus that undermined past efforts. Thus, far from abandoning its allies, because a lot of people are depicting this paper as abandoning Europe in some way, the U.S. is instead stitching them into a burden-sharing network the U.S. can use against designated adversaries, including Russia and especially China, wringing from this network additional resources to pursue U.S. foreign policy objectives, avoiding U.S. overextension, all at the expense of the network's members. So, for America's benefit at the expense of all the members of this network. It is a strategy the Trump administration already proposed. Do you remember U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February telling Europe, you're going to double down. You're going to double down on Ukraine. You're going to spend more on NATO. We're going to freeze this conflict in Ukraine with Russia. You're going to send your troops into Ukraine. You're going to assume all the risk and potential consequences for our proxy war against Russia so that we can go and contain China in the Pacific. Do you remember Secretary Hegseth saying all of this? Do you remember him saying that part of this strategy for it to succeed, European nations are going to have to speak frankly with their people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense? So when you see this theater of some sort of US-European split and people characterizing the national security strategy as some sort of split between the US and Europe, it is specifically to do this, to convince the European public that the US is abandoning Europe when it's doing nothing of the sort, to get Europeans to accept the idea of sacrificing their public programs and instead of having that money go to military industrial production, to go to propping up Ukraine, to go to confronting Russia, instead of building up their own nations and serving their own interests. That is what this is all about. It is theater. US is still using Europe as an extension of US foreign policy, and specifically in this proxy war against Russia. It simply wants to distance itself from it and the consequences that all of its proxies are suffering because of it. It is a strategy the Trump administration already proposed back in February, using Europe to take over greater costs and risks amid the ongoing war in Ukraine against Russia, freeing up US resources toward containing China and the Asia Pacific. The paper provides an example of how this network will be used against China too, in the first island chain, including China's island province of Taiwan. And it explains, and this is again a direct quote from the paper, "We will build a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain." These are waters right off of China's coasts. But the American military cannot and should not have to do this alone. Our allies must step up and spend, and more importantly, do much more for collective defense. America's diplomatic efforts should focus on pressing our first island chain allies and partners to allow the US military greater access to their ports and other facilities, to spend more on their own defense, and most importantly, to invest in capabilities aimed at deterring aggression. And when they talk about deterring aggression, they're not talking about China unilaterally, for no reason out of the blue, attacking nations in the region. They're talking about China defending itself against this architecture of containment the US is continuing to build. People interpreting this paper as some sort of signal of retreat to the Western Hemisphere must have missed this entire paragraph where they say the US will be expanding its presence right off of China's coasts, closer to China than to America's own shores, unless, of course, the first island chain moved to the Western Hemisphere. And I'm just simply not aware that happened. The most recent national security strategy outlines the continued pursuit of US primacy worldwide. It pays lip service to ideas like a genuinely mutual advantageous economic relationship with Beijing, while laying out in great detail plans to continue American military encroachment and containment of China just beyond its own shores. It claims it seeks an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine while expanding NATO spending and demanding Europe prepare to defend itself against an unnamed adversary from dominating Europe, meaning Russia. Thus, while it may be tempting for some to cherry-pick quotes from the document to indulge in wishful thinking regarding a positive shift in US foreign policy, the paper outlines what has been referred to for decades as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, bolstered by an unprecedented military buildup, the creation of a burden-sharing network, and simply resold as MAGA. And that is the article, but just to really drive this point home, you may remember me referencing this New York Times article from 1992. This is about the Wolfowitz Doctrine. US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. It even mentions Paul Wolfowitz down here as supervising the drafting of this policy. US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. If you go to the 2025 National Security Strategy, it literally says the United States cannot allow any nation to become so dominant that it could threaten our interests. And they don't mean in the Western Hemisphere or within US borders. They mean all around the globe, because then it says we will work with allies and partners to maintain global and regional balances of power to prevent the emergence of dominant adversaries. Not prevent the emergence of any dominant player in any given region and actually having a balance of power, maintaining the US as the dominant power and preventing any dominant adversary from displacing the US. So it is literally the Wolfowitz Doctrine repackaged and resold for the year 2025. So that is the article. That is the video. If you want a more in-depth look at the national security paper, the national security strategy paper, I did a deep dive. The link will be in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section and also in the video description below. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. If you want to support my channel, please do like and share. Please also follow me on these platforms. That helps build up an audience, and by sharing my work, it helps get the word out, which is my primary objective. If you would like to support my work even further, you can do so through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. I do not get paid for clicks or views or for followers. To everyone who has been, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or again, if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share and like my work, all of that greatly helps. That is what makes this work possible. Is all greatly appreciated. Thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.